Welcome to the Fledglings Group's first webinar. Our first guest is Thomas Lowe. He's a Hang 5, and how long have you been flying? 45 years, Tom?
46 now, yeah.
46 years. He's graciously offered to start us off on our series. If we do this right, we should do this on a weekly basis. We'll have a topic and a speaker for every week. And at least for the next few, it'll be Tom. And the question is, yes, I am recording. So at this point, I'll open it up to Tom and let him take it away. And I'll be doing a lot of admin tasks in the background, so I may not respond right away. Okay, Tom.
Well, thank you, Takeo. Appreciate it. And I want to also thank you for the leadership role you're playing in kind of pulling. Really, really important. Going to be talking over the next 45 minutes or so about your first double surface swing and what you really should know as you prepare to transition. So this is really geared toward pilots that are flying a single surface glider now, or perhaps have recently acquired a double surface glider and are trying to figure out how to make that move. I'm going to start by just describing a little bit. See why this is not moving. A little bit about my background, who I am. I'm just a guy who dreamed of flying like a bird since I was a little kid, probably like all of you. And that's not too unusual, except that I actually tried to do it. I built my very first wing when I was in the 4th grade as an independent class project, and this was at the birth of the sport. This is 1971 or so. Bought my first real hang glider when I was in the 6th grade. Cashed in a $600 savings bond my grandma gave me, $28 worth of lessons, and beyond that, mostly taught myself how to fly. I got a summer job at a hang gliding shop when I was still in high school, and I helped a young lady pilot pick out the colors for her first glider there. And I remember that because that lady pilot has been pretty significant in my life. I became an instructor, started flying in competitions shortly thereafter. In college, I managed to fly probably 4 days a week. Somehow I still managed to graduate. Got a real job, but I never have lost my passion for flying hang gliders. I married that young lady pilot, and we've had many memorable flying adventures together, 43 years now after we met at the hang gliding shop. So what am I going to cover here in the talk tonight? First thing is, are you ready? Are you ready to make the transition to a double surface wing? And how are you going to know when you're ready? What's the difference in the way these gliders fly? Those differences, like flying really fast, the difference in how they turn, how they land. We're going to talk about whether you should keep your old glider or not when you do this transition. And finally, what does that rope in the corner of the control bar do? All right. So are you ready? First question to ask yourself is, are you having fun on your single surface glider? And most of you are going to say yes, until you find yourself not able to penetrate or not able to fly because the winds are a little too strong. Do you sometimes find yourself way too high when you're turning final and you just have to like stuff the bar in your Falcon and burn it in? If you do that occasionally, you will need to work on your approaches, because that isn't going to cut it when you move to your double surface. Do you sometimes not get to fly because the wind is just a little too strong for your Falcon, and you're finding yourself driving up to some place and then driving home? And then finally, are your friends who have sports going on trips to sites where the glide out to the LZ just freaks you out because you just don't feel like you can penetrate? So if that latter thing is true, these are the kinds of the questions I ask. I would think anybody should ask themselves as they're preparing to move to a new glider. I often say that you should only move once you've really wrung everything possible out of your existing glider. But if some of these things ring true to you, then perhaps it is the right time. So what are the big differences between a single surface and a double surface wing? The first one, the one we all are striving for, is what we call penetration. It's the ability to fly forward in a headwind. So when you pull in on a double surface glider, you'll go fast, not just down. And that's usually what we're looking for in a hang glider. the way that the glider turns is very different. What you've been doing up until now on your Falcon, it'll only kind of work. Landing, if your LZ isn't really big or there isn't a ton of wind, you're going to need to learn how to set up an approach. And just diving in, as I said earlier, to burn up that extra height isn't going to work so well anymore on a double surface. Glide is the other big thing. When you top out or fall out of your thermal and you try to go someplace else to another thermal trigger, with a double surface, you get 2 or maybe 3 other spots to try before you have to head out to the LZ. I remember when I flew a single surface, you'd top out in a thermal and you would lose so much height just trying to try another spot that you pretty much only had 1 or 2 shots. And then finally, the down tubes are going to be airfoil shaped, and that's going to feel kind of weird the first 2 times you launch or land. So those are some of the differences that you'll experience. So about the fast, it's going to be faster than you have ever gone. And fast is really good when you're sinking out between thermals or you're trying to fly into a headwind. But it's really important that you practice going fast where it's smooth and easy. And that could be off the top of Ed Levin on a morning glide, or it could be a beautiful day on the coast. But once you can go fast in smooth air, then you need to start practicing some more where it isn't quite so smooth and isn't quite so easy. As long as there's nothing you can hit and you're able to slow down when it starts getting weird. So what is weird about going fast in a hang glider or a double surface glider? We call it PIO, or pilot induced oscillation. And frankly, it's really, really scary, and it'll probably happen to some degree to you when you first do this. And it's caused by something we call adverse yaw. And all adverse yaw is a lag between the time you put your control input in and the time the glider actually begins to roll. And what will happen as you go faster and faster is the rate at which it will roll from that input. There's always going to be a delay, but the rate at which it will roll will be much, much faster at high speed. So you give a little input and nothing happens. And if you've been holding it the whole time, by the time it starts happening, it was too much. And then you go the other way and the other way. And that's why it's called pilot induced oscillation. You're doing it. You're moving left and right and left and right. And it takes a tremendous amount of discipline to not do it. So the best and really the only way to stop it is to slow down. And it's easy. You just slow down. If you're in a turn when it happens and you let the bar out, you just do a turn and the glider will stabilize. You slow down, you regain your composure, you level the wings, and you try it again. But you need to do this in a place where it's really benign, where you can slow down, you're not getting blown back behind a ridge. You don't ever want to put yourself in a situation where you need to fly really fast, you don't know how, and you're near the ground. Those are 3 bad conditions. Once you can fly fast, you will probably still be going slower than you should between thermals. It takes a long time to learn how fast to fly in the sync between thermals. And the faster your glider is, the faster you should go between thermals. That's just a little added there. That's not so important to know at this point. So the other big difference is how the gliders turn. Now, your instructor probably taught you if the glider isn't turning when you weight shift, it's probably because you're going too slow. Or maybe you've got your shoulders one way and your feet the other, but you should just pull in and then it will turn. Well, pulling in is how you make a double surface glider go straighter. It's pushing out makes it turn and pulling in makes it go straight. So let's talk a little about the differences. If I remember right, in a single surface glider, the way you turn, you pull in a little for speed, you weight shift over to one side until the glider banks to the degree you want, and then you center your body and you let the bar out. And right before you get pointed the way you want to point, you shift your body back and you let the bar back to the trim position as the glider rolls out to flat. Well, that will kind of work in a double surface. I mean, it will turn, but it won't turn right away. And there's an easier way. And essentially, you're going to be just flying at trim. You bump the bar to the side and you bring yourself back to the middle. And you don't pull in, you just do that maneuver. And a half a second to a second later, the glider will start to roll. And as soon as you feel it begin to roll, you just let the bar out, you bump the bar out a little bit. And as soon as the bar goes out, the gliders will steepen its bank. If you pull the bar in a little bit, the glider will flatten its bank. And it's quite easy. When you're thermaling in a double surface glider, most of your roll control can be done with just letting the bar in or letting the bar out a little bit. But essentially, to exit the turn, you pull the bar in, high side a little bit, and the glider will come right out. So that's the big difference. I'm going to ask, does anyone have any questions about this? Because this is pretty, maybe non-intuitive.
If you have questions, just go ahead and jump in.
Yeah. We can pick up questions a little bit later on too. So in terms of landing, this one's going to be pretty easy. Surprise. It's not going to be that different, except you're just going to glide a whole lot further than you expected to, like way further than your Falcon. You're going to skim along the ground a lot longer than you're used to. And you shouldn't try to make any roll corrections right before you flare. Because of that delay I was telling you about, if the glider is kind of sliding one way or another, inevitably when you flare, it'll drop one wing or another. So unless you absolutely need to, it's really good to be quiet for the last 4 or 5 seconds before you push the bar out to flare to get a nice wings level landing. Moving your hands from the base tube to the down tube only when you're at trim. The double surface gliders, many of them, especially with the VG loose, will have a little more pitch pressure than maybe you're used to. It's been a while since I flew a Falcon, so I'm not 100% certain of that, but you really shouldn't be taking one hand off of your control bar if you're holding pressure with that hand, because it will cause a turn or at very least cause you to zoom up. And then once again, and I've said it now 3 times, you won't be able to dive down if you're too high. So you need to be consistent on your approaches before you start moving to your double surface, unless you just happen to have a monster LZ that you can afford to be really high on. Here's a cautionary tale, and this is going back to this weird way that double surface gliders fly. And I said that it will turn if you fly it like a Falcon, but I was once explaining this turning technique to a pilot. He was new. Out at Fort Funston. He was brand new on a Sport 2. And he'd had a great flight, and everything we had talked about, he was doing perfectly. He was bumping and letting the bar out, and the glider was just turning really sweet on a wing. He wasn't diving through his turns like he had been before. It was because I saw him kind of diving and slipping all of his turns that I spoke to him. Well, when he came into land, he turned downwind, and rather than letting the bar out in that turn, as he had been during the flight, he just leaned and pulled in. And essentially what happened was he fell back on all of his old habits under pressure. And that's really common. If when you're relaxed, you can think about what you're doing, you can do things intellectually, but you kind of revert to your training and all of your experience the minute things start to fall apart. And this poor guy, essentially, the glider never really turned much. He landed pretty much downwind, and it wasn't so pretty. So that I just want to put that out there. This is the risk of perhaps maybe getting in over your head isn't the right word, because I mean this guy was pretty capable, but not having these techniques pretty ingrained. So better to work on these techniques where you have room and you have time to practice, and it's not so critical if you forget something. All right. So should I keep my Falcon or whatever single surface glider you're flying when you get your new glider? Well, it depends. First question is, do you need to sell it just to afford your new glider? Do you have room for 2 gliders in your apartment? And are you really going to load both gliders on your car when you go out? A lot of people say, I want to keep both of my gliders because there's great days for flying this one, great days for flying that one. And that's a perfectly valid rationale. Lots of advanced pilots love them. They prefer to fly their Falcon over their hot comp glider because it's just fun. But that means you're going to have to decide before you leave, or you're going to be loading twice as many gliders. And I don't like throwing gliders on the car. That's not one of my favorite parts of the sport. It's really good to get used to your glider and going back and forth between, you know, your intermediate wing and your beginner wing or your single surfaced wing. It does come at a price of not getting dialed into the one glider you're flying all the time. And once you're a more experienced pilot, that becomes less and less of a factor. And you can jump from glider to glider and really quickly get really comfortable on the new wing. But you should just be aware of that. But truthfully, I know many pilots who have made the jump, felt like hang gliding got less fun for them. And they went back, at least for a while, to the glider that they were comfortable on until they were really, really ready to move. So if you don't have to sell your glider, I would certainly recommend keeping it until you find yourself never using it. If that comes at some point, then that's a good time to find a new home for the wing. But you may find that you just love your Falcon and you want to keep flying it, or at least have it there as an option. All right, so what does the rope do? I'm talking about the VG. What is it? What is variable geometry? So this is a way in which we can basically make our glider, change our glider's personality in the air with an adjustment that you can just reach over in the side of the control bar. And you can make your glider very, very docile or very, very slippery and difficult to fly. And you should be starting off, of course, with that VG very, very loose. But the question is, when should I start to use the VG? When should I use more of it? What I'll say is when all the way off just feels too easy. When you feel like you're flying your single surface glider again and you go, wow, when I first flew this super glider, it felt kind of stiff and it was really weird. Now I think this is just what my Falcon felt like. Well, that's your mind tricking you into, I've really learned the glider. And that's when you can start to experiment with a little bit more rope and a little bit more rope. And eventually you'll find yourself, wait, hey, it's all the way on. The first time I tried this, I couldn't even fly this glider. And now I can pull the rope all the way till it stops. And the glider still feels like it's handling pretty well. And that's how you should get into using the variable geometry. So what happens when you pull the rope? What's the experience? The first is more delay in roll input. You move over and the glider pretty much just ignores you for a while. You'll typically pick up a little bit more trim speed. So the glider will fly faster without you actually having to put an input to it. The bar pressure in pitch will become less and less. And it'll actually be easier to fly straight when you're going fast with more VG. And finally, the side wires of a glider get tighter and tighter as you pull VG on. So when the VG is all the way off, those side wires are going to be pretty loose and pretty sloppy. And that's one of the reasons why most of us will launch with maybe a quarter or a third of VG on, because it frankly just makes the side wires a little tighter and it makes the glider a little bit easier to get into the air. But also, it's always important to land with the same amount of VG each time, at least until you're really, really good, because you really want to be able to time when it's time to flare the glider. And how much VG you have on is a big factor in when it's time to flare. So if you come in and you have full VG and you flare the same time you normally do, you're going to zoom up into the sky a little bit. So best to put a mark on the VG cord, and before you come into land, always return it to the mark.
Hey, Tom, we have a question.
All right, please.
Go ahead,
go
Jessica.
Hey, Tom, it's Jess. Thanks for doing this. Hi. Hey, I was wondering if you would walk through at some point kind of the landing process in terms of when you would adjust your VG. Is that before you even start setting up your landing approach? And I was surprised to see that you moved from the base bar to the down tubes on final. So just kind of like what the order of operations is, if that's different.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about that since we were talking about landings a second ago. What I like to do is drop the VG to the landing configuration and unzip my harness both when I'm still pretty high. So if I'm flying at Funston, I'll do it on my last path pass. Like if I'm flying southbound, before I cross over the deck, I'll take care of that stuff. And then I usually do a big left 270 turn into land. So I'm configured that way, you know, so that that stuff is all out of the way. The harness is unzipped, the VG's out. Where your hands are on the down tubes, it's very much personal, and it's very much dependent on your glider and your harness. And I've heard instructors tell students, do it this way or do it that way. And I don't know if the instructors recognize always that there are many, many factors that come into play about what gives you the best control. So my recommendation is the first time you fly your new double surface glider, before you come into land, kick out of your harness like you were on final and try different positions for your hands. Down tubes, high, low, one hand up, one hand down, and find out what gives you the best speed control, okay? Because on my very advanced glider, I just can't go very fast with my hands on the down tubes. So I have to keep one hand on my base tube during my approach, or both hands sometimes, and make a transition late. Some people think of that as some kind of a show-off maneuver, but truthfully, it's because we just don't feel like we have sufficient control in pitch on those gliders. The Falcon is much, much easier to fly from the down tubes. I'm imagining that the Sport 3 may be someplace in between.
Cool, that's awesome, thanks.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up here. So these are my closing thoughts. First, the jump from the single surface wing to an intermediate double is a big one. So don't rush it. Don't go buy your glider as soon as you possibly can. Handle it. Get really good on your Falcon and do it when you just can't stand flying your single surface glider anymore, if you're not having as much fun as you think you could. But it is a huge leap, and it is really fun once you get it figured out. Many people buy their first intermediate wing flight unflown. They just say, my friends all bought X, I'm gonna go just order it. And we're lucky here in the Bay Area to live in a really high pilot density area. So we do have the potential to fly a glider like ours that we're going to order before we do. So if you can do that, I think you should, and you should do it with some help from an instructor who can help you understand what to expect. And then finally, advanced pilots, I found in general, are going to be very happy to offer advice on all matters concerning hang gliding and everything else for that matter. But I've noticed the quality of the advice you get is going to vary very widely. And it's important we pick our mentors carefully. I think everybody's well-intentioned, probably, but there's big differences in the skill and the knowledge and the ability to communicate that knowledge. So just be cautious out there. So finally, that's it. I want to open it up.
Hey, Tom, thanks for all the information.
Yeah.
So before going to VG, the slide right before VG, you talked about Falcon days versus double surface days.
Yeah.
So which day you would pick for Falcon, and which day you would pick for double surface, and how do you choose? How do you choose one to have more fun that particular day?
Great. It's a great question. So I mean, the big determining factor, the day you shouldn't fly your Falcon, is when it's really windy, or when you expect it to get windier. One of the questions, there's some of the differences of like how one glider handles turbulence versus the other. How does it respond to turbulence? There's a different subjective feel. So you may be more comfortable on a double surface in rough air than you actually would be in your Falcon. But it really comes down to, the nice day for a Falcon is light thermals and not a lot of wind. And that's a day that you could say, that's a good day for my Falcon. Now your double surface will be fine on those days too. And that's why it's a personal decision as to whether you take two gliders to the hill or not. It's just that it might be a little easier to stay up in the Falcon, even though it doesn't have as good a sink rate.
Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah. So you talked about landings and not doing any turns right before doing a flare, which is something I've been taught with the Falcon. Is you never want to flare into a turn. But I'm very used to doing small bump corrections on final up until flaring. Is that still apply? Like, don't do a bump correction because it might be delayed, or is it?
If you're really anticipating it, so any correction you do in the last few seconds is going to potentially drop a wing one way or another. You're not going to have, a landing where both wingtips are the same height off the ground when you touch down, which is obviously what you'd ultimately like. But not that it's certainly better to do the correction and not whack, but have one wingtip touching the ground. But a lot of people who have trouble with dropping a wing one way or another as they flare, it's because they're making corrections really too late in the procedure or in the approach. So if it's smooth enough to be quiet, you should endeavor to get all that yawing done with before you flare. But for God's sakes, if you need to do a roll correction because you get popped, you got to do it. And what it usually means is you just don't flare as hard because you're in a bank. You got to run it out.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, Tom, thanks a lot for this. This was excellent. I appreciate your time. Quick question on, you mentioned kind of on your first flight, it could be a coastal flight like at Funston or even Levin on a nice day on a double surface glider. I mean, do you recommend one more than the other?
It really depends on where you're most comfortable. If you're dialed into Funston and you're not like freaked out by the approach and stuff like that, then the coast is going on a nice smooth day is going to give you just boatloads of time to get to know your glider. And so I wouldn't hesitate to fly your first time on a double surface at Funston, but it really comes down to your level of comfort with, the approach and going back a little further than you're used to, and perhaps landing back in the ice plant where, it's not quite as smooth as it is up forward. But if you're a little, if you feel more comfortable at Ed Levin, then a nice high flight there is going to give you, 10, 15 minutes, 10, 12 minutes probably to get used to the glider away from everything. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not as much time in the air.
All right, great, thank you.
Yeah.
So I was talking to you earlier, and I want to make the question public.
Yeah.
I haven't flying my sport in about a year, mostly because I slowed down since my back surgery, and before that because my back was giving me too much trouble. So now that I want to go back to the Sport 3, it turns out that I'm living in a mountainside, and it's very different than what I'm used to. I'm more like a flatland pilot, and probably more also like ridge soaring. Funston was my home site, and I learned in the flats. So I haven't quite figured out the mountains flying yet. So I've been practicing a lot in my Falcon, and I feel like I'm still having a hard time. So my question is, I really want to fly my Sport 3, especially because here at Crestline, I feel like I'll be more comfortable knowing that I'm going to make it to a landing zone in a better performance glider. And that's what ultimately I want to keep flying as my sport. But should I first get better at soaring in thermals in the mountains in the Falcon and then transition? Or should I just, I've flown the sport for a while before I stopped. So I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think we were talking earlier in the month about like the afternoon turbulence and everything as well. And there we were saying, well, what about glass offs? And, not launching at 1 or 2 in the afternoon, but moving your launch back to 5 or 5:30 in the afternoon when it feels like Funston, but just lift everywhere. And
Right.
the best of both worlds. You've got, nice smooth air. You don't have to have perfect technique to stay up. and you can get really dialed into it. You're not going to get popped around on your approach the way you would. So I guess what I would suggest is start getting used to your sport in really benign mountain conditions, like late in the afternoon when things are like really lifting off. And you know, if, off the top of Crestline, even if it's not super soarable, it's still going to be a pretty nice long flight.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Does that work for you, Maho? You think that kind of a
Was that?
approach would pan out?
Yeah. But what I was wondering is, like, should I be worried about jumping into the Sport 3 when I'm not used to the mountains, or you think I'll be okay, you know, stepping
Yeah.
up?
Well, I mean, I honestly
That makes
think you would be okay, but like I always said, it's got to be fun. So if you
Yeah.
have anxiety about it, then fly the sport until you're pretty comfortable with the sport, you know, on the mountain, and then go to your, excuse me, I meant the Falcon. Fly the Falcon until you're comfortable with the Falcon, or you're comfortable with the site, and then try the sport really late in the afternoon when it's really mellow.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, that helps a lot.
Awesome.
Hey, Tom, thanks for holding the call.
No worries.
So my question is, I mean, as we all know, single surface Falcon, it's pretty darn impossible. You really got to make those things stall, right? You really got to push out. It's pretty much impossible to get into a spin. I know with, you know, higher performance gliders, double surface, topless gliders, those things will stall. You know, you can get those things to spin. So, I mean, what are your tips when you're kind of thermaling, you know, close to terrain? Are you more careful? What are you doing with the VG to make sure you're not going to get into a situation where you're stalling or spinning near terrain?
So good news is that even the most highest performance gliders are still amazingly resistant to spinning. If you stall it in a turn, it's not going to be real pretty. Don't get me wrong, but you know, advanced aerobatic pilots really want to spin their gliders, and they only get to do it maybe 3 out of 4 times or 3 out of 5 times it works. So it isn't like, oops, I just spun. Even on a T2C drum tight with the VG all the way on. But that being said, not stalling when you don't want to stall is really important. And when you're thermaling next to terrain, you know, it's always about having that energy margin when you're getting ready to turn back at the hill. And that energy margin can be height, you know, what we call potential energy, or it can be extra speed, extra bar pressure you're carrying as you go and commit to that turn, so that if you fall out the back of the thermal when you're pointing back at the hill, you still have that energy that you can afford to let the bar out and wrap the turn around quickly. So it's really an energy management question. If you're flying in the middle of the afternoon, you know, and flying close to the hill, you really need to know and be dialed into your glider's energy retention, and know that as you commit to those turns that you have enough to finish them, or you shouldn't be that close to the hill. And that is, again, where starting off with, you know, glass off flights where you get to stay up for a long time, you get to work these big, flat, more and more tolerant to the strong thermals, you just start moving that launch time earlier and earlier in the day until you're launching in the middle of the day. So that's how I recommend newer pilots kind of build a turbulence tolerance, and kind of build the judgment around how to control the energy of your glider in a turn. Did I get what did I answer the question you were asking?
Absolutely, much appreciated.
All right. I'll just say about the spin, the thing that makes the gliders actually spin is too much pitch and too much high siding. So if you find yourself pushing out and moving your body really hard to the high wing, that's what the advanced aerobatic pilots try to do to cause it to spin. what that's doing is it's flattening out the inside wing and billowing out the outside wing, causing the inside wing's angle of attack to go high enough for it to stall. So as long as you stay coordinated, you shouldn't have any problem with inadvertent spins.
So I was surprised when you said that you might find the double surface more comfortable to fly in turbulence. The concerns for me in turbulence are getting rolled into a turn that I didn't expect, or getting tumbled. And I think both of those things or my impression was both of those things are worse on the sport. It's got a wider wingspan, so it's more susceptible to, if you fly halfway through thermal, and then it's got a shorter chord length. So like what does feel more comfortable in turbulence? What's the difference there?
Yeah, so I mean, comfort is a subjective thing. What I have found in the glider I fly is when things are light and punchy, I'll have the VG very, very loose. But when things are really, really strong and the thermals are larger, I prefer the way that it feels to fly much, much faster and carve bigger turns. That feels far more stable, and I get bumped around a lot less. So again, with my T2C, if I fly with a VG all the way off and I try to thermal that way, I find myself constantly either overbanking or underbanking, always making adjustments to try and get a nice, steady, even bank turn, a round circle. When the VG gets pulled on tighter, the glider becomes much more stable in terms of wanting to just lock into that one bank angle, and it takes less energy to fly. But your point of not having as much control or roll authority on a double surface glider or any glider with VG on is absolutely right. You don't have the control power, but it seems like the glider is less apt to be disturbed as well. In terms of pitching over and tumbling, damping, which is pretty much a function of like the chord, the length of your glider from nose to tail. The Falcon is really, really damped. It is a very, very tumble resistant design. The higher performance gliders have all these extra bells and whistles, sprogs and reflexed wing ribs. In the old days, I mean, by that I mean in the 80s and around then, we used to go over the falls when we were thermaling all the time. And that's a term we used for when you fall out of a thermal and the glider's nose just drops and drops and drops and drops, and you're almost weightless before it kind of catches. And in the last 15 years, I've been flying the T2C. I don't think that's happened at all. So the designs have really advanced. They are all very tumble resistant. That's not to say that there isn't air out there that you don't want to find in a hang glider. There clearly is. I think you probably see Soham posted a video recently that was kind of an eye-opener for a lot of people. But that's very, very unusual. One last thing. The ability to get away from wherever you are, if it's crappy there, is way, way better in a double surface. So if you don't like the air you're in and you want to go someplace else, it's really frustrating to just pull in and not move. So that's the other advantage of having legs, having a glider that can move quickly over terrain, even into a headwind, to get out from trouble.
So I have a question, Tom, about launching in light wind or no wind with loose VG compared to the Falcon. Is it a pretty significantly longer run?
You know, that's a great question. I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly how to answer it. I think you might find it not that different. But I want to be very careful here because I haven't done enough light wind launches on the Sport or the Falcon to be completely sure. I guess all I can say is, well, here's an example. When you flew the Sport that I loaned you, Were you surprised with how slowly it flew before it flared?
No, but also that was at the fort where there's, plenty of wind.
Right, right. I just remember the first time I flew it again, that it was like we would flare and it would just like zoom up, and I thought really slow. And I think I thought maybe you had that same experience and kind of learned to wait a little bit. The point is that these double surface gliders are they're more efficient, which means that they actually can lift off and fly at a really nice high angle of attack pretty effectively. They're not as benign in the stall as the Falcon is, but I think they may actually be able to fly a little slower.
Yeah, got it. Okay, that's actually opposite of what I was anticipating. So that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You mind
if Takeo, do you have any perspective on that? Because
actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to add a little anecdote.
I would.
So I actually transitioned from single surface to double surface probably way too early in my career, and I got bit primarily not because of the takeoff speed so much, but what I found is that a sport, especially a 2 compared to a Falcon, that's a much greater gap than a sport between a Falcon and a Sport 3, for example. The 3 is much more forgiving at low airspeed and high angle of attack. But that drop of wing, the tip stall that you mentioned in the flare, is more pronounced on launch if you have bad pitch control. So what I found is what I've been trying to help people with through this transition, because there's a lot of people doing this very transition right now, is to go back to the Falcon and really go back to the basics and really get their launch technique down so that they have they have precise control over their initial pitch attitude and their angle of attack. And maybe you don't have to take off quite as fast, but even with a little bit of VG on, if you don't have that extra speed, you'll find that you won't have as good lateral control. So as we always been preaching, is a strong launch, strong launch, strong launch. I think in the sport class series, your first double surface glider, I think that's even more important than it would be on a Falcon. I had some really, really bad habits in my single surface that really came back to bite me when I moved to sports, and I had to spend a lot of time rebuilding my launch technique. So a good example is Miss Io. We transitioned her at about 30 hours or so. And I think that's a pretty good sweet spot. Some people can go earlier, other people need to go later, but it really comes down to like when you're first, if I like take video of your launch and your pitch control is inconsistent or sloppy on a sport glider, that will definitely bite you. That's all I had. Thanks. Good.
No, that's good. That's the one phase of flight that I completely, didn't even speak to. And it's been a while since I made that transition myself, and I'm going back into my own memory of what it was like when I jumped from my Raven to a Duck, which was my first double surface glider in 1980. So it's good to have a more recent perspective. Thank you for that, Takeo.
Okay. I did have one. I'm sorry, go ahead, sir.
I was going to say, we can open it up to other topics too. It doesn't just have to be around this. Well, I'll do different talks on different topics, in the week.
Well, that's a great segue, because I got a question from Eric from Guatemala.
Yeah.
Let's see. He says, could you give us advice for changing from a U2 to a topless glider?
Sure. Yeah. So first thing is, it's going to be another big jump. You can fly your topless with the VG very, very soft at first, and I would strongly recommend that you not be in too big of a hurry to pull the rope on, because the amount of character change in a topless from VG loose to VG tight is, I would say, double the change in your sport or the U2. It really changes its personality. But there's nothing that says you have to pull the rope on. And I was talking to a pilot recently who in her sport hasn't used the VG much. And my recommendation to her would be, fly the sport with more and more and more VG before making a transition to a double surface or to a topless, because you should be pretty comfortable flying your U2 with full VG or most VG. Ultimately, you don't really need a topless unless you're flying your U2 with a lot of rope out. The biggest difference, I would say, in the gliders, I'm not sure what double surface he's thinking about going to. I'm imagining a T2. With the rope all the way on, the pitch pressure, well, the U2 is light in pitch pressure as well. Maybe it's just mostly, doing slipping turns with the topless. You can build up a tremendous amount of speed, much more than I think in a king posted glider. And that might be the biggest thing to watch out for, is not try to do diving turns in the topless wing. It takes a lot of room to land, but just work up to that slowly. Don't try to fly it into a postage stamp until you're really, really comfortable with the way it flies. But you'll find that with the VG all the way soft, they're pretty predictable. They're not that difficult to roll. They have a lot of pitch pressure, maybe more than you're used to. And that's my only complaint about my topless, is that with the VG all the way off, the pitch pressure is really high. It really takes a lot to hold the bar in.
Fantastic. So, Tom, I heard a comment from Carl Almendinger. I was wondering about your thoughts about this. He basically says is that whenever you go up a glider, you drop down one level in skill. So, like if you're a 3 and you've moved up to a double surface, you should look at yourself as a hang 2. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, if that means that you're a hang 3 and you can fly Funston, and now you don't think you can because you're a hang 2, I don't think that makes sense. But
well, sure.
This is just an anecdote. It is really, really important to realize that our skills are not constant. They go up, they go down. If you take a long break from flying, you need to think very, very consciously about, hey, I'm not, you maybe you think you're still hot because you were great last summer at the end of the season, but if you've just taken 6 months off because it's been snowing and you're getting back into it, you got to give yourself extra margin. And that's a really hard learned lesson. One that I learned the hard way. I came back in the middle of the winter. I went and did a towing flight, having not flown for a long time. And I flew with the same, and it could have been really bad. I was very, very lucky. But yes, I should think of myself as one rating back. But from a literal standpoint, no, I don't think you lose that much, but you should be making accommodations to the choices that you make in flying. The conditions you're going to launch into, the LZ, what skill level it's going to take to safely land there.
Okay, good. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, this is kind of a related question. Something I've been taught is that if you haven't flown in a little while, to build up confidence again, going back to 11 and going to 50 foot. Would that have value in this transition, or is it more about like the conditions?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where your skills are when you start this. If you're a hang 3 pilot and you're soaring at Funston and you're really, really comfortable with that, then going back to a training hill, while it has value and probably it makes sense before you go to the mountains, if you're just trying to get this new glider figured out, there really isn't much better than a perfect day on the coast to do that, where you can focus on flying and not focus on staying up, for example. And you can get an hour or 2 of experience as opposed to 10 or 15 seconds near the ground where everything's going to happen really quick. I do think that there is value before you go, to Hull or someplace where you have a high altitude, potentially difficult launch for the first time without a lot of headwind. Yeah, you should go fly someplace more benign, put some wheels on your glider perhaps, do a few flights off the 50, or I mean, it could be the 300 for that matter, but just get some launches and landings under your belt so that you can have the confidence when you go to the mountains and there isn't, you know, room for error.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Bailey, and then I saw Annabelle raise their hand. I'm willing to take that question, but you got to let me know if you've got a question for you. All right, go ahead, Bailey.
Sweet. So you mentioned that you'll need more room for the landings. Can you go through some of the specific sites? Like I know Hat Creek Landing Zone 3, I think, starts needing actual RLF skills to land in on a double surface. And then Hull gets easier.
Hull is easy. And the new Dunlap place looks pretty tricky to me. Seems somewhat restrictive because you don't really have a lot of turning options to burn off height. I mean, clearly Tres Pinos and places like that are wide open. Ed Levin is wide open. There are a few places as a hang 3 that I can think of that are truly restricted landing field required. It's going to take more room, but there aren't that many really small fields. Go to hang 4 level and you're talking about places like Mission or Windy Hill, and there are some really small fields that are a real challenge even for advanced pilots. Not so much Mission, but Windy Hill, for example. But I guess, you know, downhill is another challenge, right? And depending on, you know, Hat Creek is a high altitude LZ, and depending on which way you land, I guess it's not completely flat. So that can have a factor.
Yeah, it's sort of unforgiving of belly landings too. So I'm definitely got to be Johnny on the spot.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of the other place that we fly out by Dunlap.
McClure?
No.
Toll House.
What was that?
Toll House.
Toll House. Thank you. Yeah, there's another kind of interesting LZ. Lots of rolling hills, pretty restrictive. That one might not be the great place for your first try on double surface for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of wind shadow from the trees, and the directions change on a fairly regular basis, and there's a lot of inclination. So
yeah. But Hull is, I think, a pretty good spot. You know, the thing about flying Hull is until you really know your wing and you know the site, you should always be heading toward the lake if you're not climbing, and that will generally give you a really nice long flight, and it keeps you out of trouble. The people I've seen end up in the trees at Hull or behind the ridge have gone the wrong way, chasing lift or chasing the thermal that they thought was back there, only to find themselves now trapped. So that's a big mistake to make. If you just keep pointing toward the lake, if you're not going up, I think it's a pretty good place to get some great high altitude thermaling practice.
okay, we're at the top of the hour. If nobody has any questions additional, I'll go ahead and conclude it. But I just want to thank Tom for his time and his knowledge. And I also want to thank everybody for what I feel is a pretty successful first seminar. And if you could, those of you who are in the Fledglings group, could you leave me feedback on how you felt that the seminar went, and if you could give me suggestions for how we could do this better in the future. We'll schedule the next one and put the next one up when we're ready. I'm thinking next week, Tom, if you're available.
I think I will. Yeah, I don't think of anything going on Thursday, so let's pencil that in and figure out which topic we want to do next.
Yeah. Did you have any final thoughts, Tom?
No, I want to just also express my thanks to everybody who listened in and for your participation. It's really fun, and it's great to have so much renewed interest in the sport.
Fantastic. Okay. Thanks very much for joining, and everybody have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Tom.
Later, guys.
Thank you, Tom. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Mo. Bye.
You, Thomas.